From the earliest Mesopotamian and Greek myths, the creators of Western culture, storytellers, writers, and artists, have imagined other times and places where life is different from what we know. Nature is different, or people are different, or the human condition itself is different. The urge to describe such times and places is a constant across human history, but the settings of these imagined stories have changed. They have been set in the past, in the future, on other continents, and ultimately in other worlds or dimensions. We have also seen changes to the forms in which these stories are told, the audience they're meant to reach, and the attitudes and tone they convey. In the oldest of these stories, there was a world before ours in which the rules of nature differed from our own, and for the better. No physical labor, no harsh weather, no hunger, and even no death. People were stronger than we are and lived longer than we do. We find these kinds of legends in both ancient Near Eastern literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Hebrew Bible, and in Greek myths, which were already ancient by the time they were made into poetry in the middle of the first millennium BCE. Later on in the ancient world, a rich body of Greek and Latin literature was being created across the Mediterranean, which instead of myths turned to theoretically real but distant and exotic places, which their readers could never have visited and knew very little about, as the setting of exciting stories. They even invented places out of whole cloth. Their narratives related exciting and often chaotic adventures, which took the characters to exotic foreign lands like India and involved them in fantastic or magical events. And like the Magi in the New Testament Gospels, the people responsible for these events were foreigners from the fringes of the known world. In the Middle Ages, on the other hand, people tended to look to the ancient world, whose ruins surrounded them, but about which they knew much less than we do, as a time of fantastic accomplishments which they themselves could not achieve. This made it a perfect setting for fictional stories about heroic deeds and romance, and it provided the material for one of three popular medieval poetry cycles, which was set during the Trojan War. The other two cycles were set respectively in the court of King Arthur and his knights, and in the time of the Emperor Charlemagne, who founded the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century CE. The fact that Charlemagne had been a real person, and Arthur probably was not, tells us that there were no substantial boundaries between an actual past and an imagined one. By the 15th century, Europeans had begun to explore distant places in the New World, Asia, and Africa. Just as the maps of these regions combined actual data with speculation about regions that were still entirely unknown, accounts of fantastic cultures and peoples began to circulate alongside actual ones, such as the African Christian kingdom of Prester John, the Fountain of Youth, and the Golden City of El Dorado. Then, as the roster of undiscovered countries began to shrink in the 16th and 17th centuries, the European Enlightenment encouraged creators to envision a world in which the application of reason would solve the social and technological problems, disease, poverty, oppression, and inequality, which had plagued humanity even in the ancient past. But they placed the ideal societies they imagined in still undiscovered countries or islands. Among these societies were Sir Thomas More's Utopia and Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun. Later on, in the 18th century, the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution began to take hold. Developments in chemistry, medicine, and technology encouraged creators to turn their attention to the future, which seemed to promise wonderful forms of progress for humanity and for the world. And as new planets were discovered and the science of astronomy developed, authors began to wonder about the moon and other worlds, which they expected we would someday visit or be visited by. These scientific developments helped to create the distinction we now recognize between science fiction and fantasy. Just as the thorough mapping of the world made it harder to invent fictional islands and continents, our growing knowledge about the natural world meant that books and stories which did not adhere to the laws of that world had to be placed in a separate category from those that did. That's why modern fantasy draws on many of the same elements that we find in pre-scientific literature going back to the Mesopotamian: magical spelled objects, supernatural creatures, castles, knight, and quest. But to maintain our suspension of disbelief, it has to be set in some alternate dimension where the rules are different from ours, or in the same imagined past in which medieval authors placed their stories. Even within the world of science fiction, our imaginative culture is affected by the progress of scientific discovery. Compare, for example, Robinson Crusoe on Mars from 1964 with The Martian from 2015. One is pure fantasy, in which the hero has air to breathe and encounters aliens, and the other is barely science fiction at all, as it draws on current information about Mars and the technology developed by actual space missions. The same thing is true of movies made before and after the moon landings of the 1960s and 70s. Not only does the surface of the moon become more realistic in subsequent stories, but what happens there comes closer to the realities experienced by the astronauts. There are no aliens, ruins, or weird technology. An interesting way of dealing with this change was invented by the 1964 film The First Man in the Moon, which was based on a 1901 novel by H.G. Wells. In that story, which Wells acknowledged was a fantasy, men of his time reach the moon and encounter insect-like inhabitants called selenites. The movie, on the other hand, is set in the time it was made, when astronauts, who appear more or less as the Apollo astronauts of a few years later would, spaceship, spacesuits, low gravity, arrive on the moon and encounter evidence of an earlier visit by men from England. This leads into the Wells story, and when the film switches back to the modern-day astronauts at the end, they discover that the civilization described in the novel has turned to dust, preserving in this way both the fantasy of the past and the scientific reality of the present. The flights of imagination created over the last 3,000 years have been conveyed through many different kinds of genres. As we said at the start, the peoples of the ancient Mediterranean produced what the Greeks called myth. Myths were stories or tales which writers like the philosopher Plato and the historian Herodotus considered what we would call fictional. Though Greek myths had originally been handed down by word of mouth and vocal performance, they eventually became the raw material for poems like the Iliad and plays like the Oedipus of Sophocles. Then, under the Roman Empire, a new type of literature appeared: long prose works that resembled the later European novel in the sense that they told a story about a set of characters who experienced a sequence of events, though they often used this frame to work in a number of other stories which were unrelated to the main narrative. In the Middle Ages, imaginative tales were told through the Romance, a type of long poem in rhyming couplets, which got its name from the fact that it was written not in Latin, but in an early form of the European languages we still call Romance. While many of these tales did center on the pure love between a courtly couple, they might also be interested in heroic deeds performed in battle, such as the kind of duels between pairs of warriors that we find in the Iliad. During the Renaissance, the realm of the imagination turned back toward prose, and a number of long works were written which contained many of the elements of stories or fables, fantastic events or creatures, unknown lands, and drastic turns of fortune. The most canonical version of the story of King Arthur and the Round Table, Le Morte d'Arthur, was written at this time. There were also prose works whose purpose was to satirize the real world of the present by comparing it with a fantastic one. One of the most famous of these is the Gargantua and Pantagruel of the French writer Rabelais. Once the novel became an established form of art in the 18th century, it was used to create entirely new tales in the genre called Gothic, which often combined elements of fantasy and horror. The most famous of these are the Frankenstein of Mary Shelley and the Dracula of Bram Stoker. Frankenstein had a particularly scientific tone, since Shelley was influenced by real-life experiments in electricity and its connection with living tissue. They were also 18th and 19th century writers who created literary adaptations of the traditional folk tales of their homelands which then became the standard versions of those stories, such as Charles Perrault in France and the Grimm brothers in Germany. Some of these writers, like the Danish Hans Christian Andersen, created their own original stories in the style of traditional tale. This laid the foundation for modern fantasy novelists like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote the Tarzan and John Carter book, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who created an entire mythology that drew on the medieval poetic works he taught as a university professor. And like Burroughs and Tolkien, the authors of modern fantasy often use the worlds they create as the setting for adventures like quests, battles, and journeys. In the 20th century, the popularization of science and scientists led to the development of science fiction, which could take the form of short stories, novels, or series of novels. Many writers started as contributors to the SF magazines that ran short pieces, and went on, like Isaac Asimov, to produce full novels. Asimov, Frank Herbert, and a number of others created entire future histories which could span galaxies and thousands of years. The medium of film borrowed the plots and themes of SF novels, as when the director Stanley Kubrick turned Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey into a landmark film. 1968's Planet of the Apes was also based on an earlier novel. There have been two versions of Herbert's Dune, long considered unfilmable because of its enormous scope and deep backstory. The most successful original SF series, which also has elements of fantasy, is of course Star Wars. More purely fantasy novels, like The Never-Ending Story and Aragon, have also been made into films, as have more recently the novels of Tolkien. Because television, on the other hand, is more episodic in character, it has lent itself more to SF stories than to novels. Some of the most popular early TV series were anthology shows like The Twilight Zone, which hired established SF writers like Theodore Sturgeon to adapt their stories or create new ones. Starting in the 1960s, there were periods in which weekly episodes were independent of one another, but were built upon a basic continuing premise, such as Lost in Space, which was geared more toward kids, The Time Tunnel, and of course Star Trek. Extended story arc, covering many episodes, began to appear in the 1990s, with Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. And the modern idea of a mythology that lays behind all of the series' individual stories is popularized by shows like The X-Files and Fringe. These various flights of fancy have not always been intended for one and the same audience. Though the modern West tends to reserve purely imaginative work, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, etc., for younger readers, the ancient stories that are now a staple of colorful children's books were full of violence and assault. And while the Greek myths began as oral folk tales, they became in the classical world the raw material for sophisticated plays that delved into human conflicts and motivations. The medieval fairy tales, which were collected in the 19th century by scholars of folklore like the Brothers Grimm, also began as stories told by and to adults, though the world in which they developed did not, like ours, try to shield children from the culture of their parents. Older versions of the Cinderella story, for example, have her stepsister cutting off her own toes so that she can fit into the glass slipper kept by the prince. While Rapunzel, who has been kept in a tower by the sorceress since reaching puberty, becomes pregnant from the prince's visits, but has been so isolated that she does not understand why her clothes no longer fit. Nowadays, stories like these have been turned into Mother Goose collections and Disney films. This process also moves in the other direction. We now have blockbusters whose roots lie in the comic books that were originally aimed at kids and teenagers, and science fiction, which used to be the province of pulp magazines and wasn't well known for sophisticated ideas and prose, has developed into a number of subgenres that include serious explorations of scientific developments and critiques of contemporary society and culture. Just as the forms and the audiences of imaginative works are varied, so have the goals and intentions of the people who create them. Ancient stories of golden ages were in one sense expressions of wish fulfillment, and in another, they were a sad reflection on the obvious flaws of the present, in which nature and God were often unkind and life was a struggle for survival. while the idea that the past had been a time of heroes offered a more exciting alternative to the dull realities of the present described in Hesiod and in the book of Genesis after the fall of man. The work of Homer itself contains storytellers who enthrall their audience with tales of the great heroes of the Trojan War, which in the story, of course, is a recent event. On the other hand, epics like the Aeneid, which was written by the first-century Roman poet Virgil, helped to establish a foundation myth which explained the origins of the nation and set out the values it held dear. Such stories celebrated the present as the realization and the goal of the struggles of the past. In the medieval European world that followed the collapse of the Roman Empire, very little of the ancient literature and archaeological remains that ancient historians have at their disposal today were available for study. This, combined with the impressive remains they did know about, allowed the authors of the 12th and 13th centuries to see the distant past as a blank slate for their imaginative impulses, which they felt free to describe in terms that were familiar to them, just as the artists of the time painted scenes in which ancient characters were dressed in contemporary clothing and stood amid contemporary architecture. The result was a group of entertaining and moving poems in which the heroes acted like ideal medieval knights, either fighting heroic battles or engaging in courtly romances. And the same approach was applied to the heroes of the Arthur legend like Lancelot, Galahad, and Percival. There was also an ideological element to some of these works, which were written at the time of the Crusade in the Muslim Middle East. They portrayed the fight between Christians and Muslims as a centuries-old conflict, and like the ancients described in these poems, their version of Muslims and their beliefs was mostly a product of their imaginations, though in this case it was a completely negative one. The literature of the Age of Exploration, the 15th through 18th centuries, often combined actual information about distant places with more fanciful descriptions that depended on the ignorance of both author and reader. Shakespeare alludes to these descriptions when he has Othello refer to his travels. And of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagi, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. And some authors, like Voltaire and Jonathan Swift, simply invented their own islands or countries. These inventions could be parodies of the real world, since their authors were critics who wanted to contribute to the debates over politics and society, which were then shaping the future of Europe. For Jonathan Swift, for example, the only ideal society he could think of was run by horses. Others, like Sir Thomas More, tried to devise utopias which would illustrate what they hoped would eventually happen. The age of exploration gave way to the scientific and industrial revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, when writers and artists started to look to the future rather than the past, and they became fascinated with both the progress and the dangers they saw on the horizon. Books like Frankenstein and The Island of Dr. Moreau reflected recent discoveries in human anatomy and the nature of life, while Jules Verne and H.G. Wells were interested in machines that could be used to explore, to benefit, or to destroy. Perhaps the best illustration of this dichotomy is the novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, about a scientist who, in a quest to understand human nature, is split into good and evil halves. As science has progressed, so have the specific concerns of the creators of our culture. The 20th and 21st centuries are full of speculations about the future of robotics, genetic engineering, and space exploration. And instead of the distant islands and continents where fantastic societies used to be set, we now turn to alternate versions of the present or the past. But these speculations are often far from optimistic, and ever since Frankenstein, our literature and films have been wary of the consequences of unfettered and ambitious scientific progress. The novel's subtitle is The Modern Prometheus, an allusion to the Greek Titan who was punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity. We also have films like Alien to warn us about soulless corporations, which even in the future will practice the greed and short-sightedness that trouble us today. And yet, 2001 ends with the next step in human evolution, while Star Trek proposes that not only technology, but people themselves will improve. Even today, there are works like The Martian and For All Mankind that see the future as an opportunity for us to reach for the stars. Over the course of this series, we'll look at products of the imagination, the settings in which they were placed, and what they wanted to say. In the ancient West, the European Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the ages of exploration and enlightenment, and the modern era. Please remember to like and subscribe.